They thought he was just another easy target, a quiet man alone in a diner, but when the bikers pushed too far, they learned the hard way that some battles are over before they begin. The wind had a bite to it that afternoon as Max Carter pulled his truck into the gravel parking lot of John's diner. The air was heavy with the scent of dry earth and faint exhaust, a reminder that this stretch of Route 66 hadn't seen rain in weeks. John's diner wasn't much to look at, just a weathered building with faded paint and a flickering neon "open" sign hanging crookedly in the window. Beside it, a gas station stood like a relic of better days, its rusting pumps long out of commission. Time moved differently here, slow and unhurried, as if the world beyond the highway barely mattered. Max Carter cut the engine, the faint rumble of his truck fading into silence. For a moment he sat still, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His gaze lingered on the diner, taking in the peeling trim, the checkered curtains, and the way the sunlight slanted through the dusty windows. It was the kind of place that drew travelers with nowhere in particular to be. But Max Carter wasn't looking for much, just a meal, maybe a quiet corner to gather his thoughts. He reached for his worn baseball cap, tugging it low over his face before stepping out of the truck. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the lot, his steady gait betraying none of the fatigue that clung to his shoulders. The bell above the door jingled sharply when he entered, its sound cutting through the low hum of the diner's interior. Inside, the atmosphere was just as he'd expected. Vinyl booths cracked with age lined the walls, and checkered tiles stretched out beneath mismatched tables. A jukebox sat dormant in the corner, its bright colors dulled by years of neglect. The air carried the faint aroma of burnt coffee and grease, the signature scent of every roadside diner. Behind the counter, Lena worked quietly, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. As Max Carter stepped further inside, the faint murmur of conversation tapered off. Heads turned, and a weight settled over the room. It wasn't the kind of curiosity born of politeness, but something colder, more deliberate. The stares lingered, sizing him up as if his presence alone needed explanation. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge the eyes following him. Instead, he scanned the room, his expression unreadable, until he found a booth near the window. Old habits guided him there, the kind that kept his back to a wall and his view unobstructed. As he slid into the seat, the stares didn't waver. From a corner table, a group of bikers in leather vests exchanged low murmurs, their laughter muted but pointed. Max Carter settled into the booth, his movements calm and deliberate. He placed his cap on the table, smoothing its brim as though nothing in the room concerned him. But as he looked toward the counter, Lena approached, pen in hand, her eyes darting nervously toward the bikers. Something about her unease confirmed what Max Carter already knew. This wasn't going to be just another quiet stop. Lena hesitated as she reached Max Carter's booth, her pen tapping lightly against the edge of her notepad. Her eyes flicked to the group of bikers in the corner before settling on him, her smile tight and fleeting. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice low, as though she didn't want to draw attention. "Cheeseburger, fries, and a black coffee," Max Carter replied evenly. His voice carried no urgency, no frustration, just calm. It was a tone that often disarmed people, but Lena barely nodded before scribbling the order and hurrying off, her unease palpable. Max Carter leaned back, letting his gaze drift out the window. Outside, a lone tumbleweed rolled across the lot, the dry wind tugging at the corners of the faded Route 66 sign near the gas station. Inside, the air seemed to grow heavier. The low hum of conversation that had resumed after his entrance now ebbed again, replaced by the distinct sound of boots scuffing the floor. From the corner of his eye, Max Carter caught movement. One of the bikers, a broad man with a thick beard and a leather vest patched with faded insignias, leaned back in his chair. His knuckles, inked in dark tattoos, drummed against the edge of the table as he spoke, just loud enough to be overheard. "Well, would you look at that?" the man drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "Seems we got ourselves a drifter." The others at his table chuckled, the sound sharp and ugly. Max Carter didn't react. The lack of response only seemed to embolden the man. "Hey, buddy," he called out, louder now. "You deaf or just rude?" The tension in the diner coiled tighter. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Max Carter and the bikers. Behind the counter, Lena stood frozen, her hand hovering near the coffee pot as if debating whether to intervene or stay out of it entirely. Max Carter set his mug down with deliberate care, the faint clink of ceramic against the saucer louder than it should have been in the silence. Slowly he lifted his gaze, meeting the biker's stare for the first time. "Something I can help you with?" Max Carter asked, his tone measured. There was no edge, no hint of anger, just a quiet steadiness that seemed to catch the man off guard, if only for a moment. The biker's smirk faltered before returning with twice the bravado. "Yeah," he said, leaning forward. "You can tell me what you're doing sitting there like you own the place. Don't you know how things work around here?" The others at his table chuckled again, though not as confidently as before. Max Carter didn't flinch, didn't move beyond the faintest tilt of his head. "Just here for lunch," he said simply. "That a problem?" For a moment the biker didn't respond. The quiet confidence in Max Carter's voice wasn't what he'd expected. Around them, the diner seemed to hold its breath, every eye on the two men. The biker leaned closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Yeah, it's a problem, and I think you ought to fix it." But Max Carter didn't need to respond. The silence between them said more than words ever could. The biker's smirk deepened as the room waited for Max to respond. But instead of speaking, Max simply sat back, his shoulders relaxed, his hand steady as it reached for the mug of coffee once more. He took a slow sip, as if the man towering over him wasn't even there. The calmness was unsettling, a sharp contrast to the tension suffocating the diner. "Hey, Ope," the biker barked, slamming a hand down on the table. The salt and pepper shakers rattled, and the sound ricocheted through the room like a gunshot. "I'm talking to you." Max lowered his mug with deliberate care and raised his eyes again, his gaze steady. "I heard you," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear, it was something else entirely, something unshakable. Lena flinched behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge as she glanced between them. One of the regulars shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath, but no one moved to intervene. This wasn't their fight, and they weren't about to make it theirs. The biker stepped closer, his leather vest creaking as he leaned in, his face inches from Max's. "You think you're better than me, ha? Sitting there like you own the place." His breath reeked of stale beer and bravado. Max didn't flinch. "I don't think about you at all," he replied evenly, the words cutting through the air like a blade. That did it. The biker's face twisted, the thin veneer of control shattering. "You've got a smart mouth," he snarled. "Let's see if it's as quick as your fists." He reached out, his hand darting toward Max's collar, but he didn't get far. In a blur of movement, Max's hand shot up, catching the man's wrist mid-air. His grip was firm, unyielding, but not violent. It was a warning, delivered without a word. "Don't," Max said softly, his voice low but carrying an authority that filled the room. The biker froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. The quiet strength in Max's voice wasn't something he was used to facing. Around them, the diner seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside the only sounds. "Let him go," one of the other bikers called out, rising from his seat. He was wiry, with stringy hair and a patchy beard. The others followed, scraping their chairs back as they stood, their movements loud and deliberate, meant to intimidate. Max released the biker's wrist, letting his hand drop as he straightened. The man stumbled back a step, rubbing his arm and glaring at Max. "You're gonna regret that," he spat, his voice trembling with anger more than confidence now. Max stood, his movements slow, deliberate, as he turned to face the group. His expression didn't change, still calm, still unreadable. "If you walk away now," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to command attention, "you won't have to." The leader, Gus, laughed, though it sounded forced. "Big words for a guy who's outnumbered," he sneered, glancing at his crew for support. "You think you can take all of us?" Max didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I don't need to," he said finally, his tone as even as ever. "But if you want to find out, I won't stop you." The room went silent again. The other patrons stayed glued to their seats, watching with a mix of fear and fascination. Lena whispered a quiet plea to herself, hoping it wouldn't come to blows. But it did. The wiry man moved first, lunging toward Max with a wild swing. It was sloppy, desperate, and easily countered. Max sidestepped effortlessly, catching the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. The biker let out a pained yelp as Max guided him into a nearby booth, pinning him there with nothing more than controlled precision. The second man hesitated, then charged, fists swinging. Max dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard, the air rushing from his lungs in a single sharp gasp. Gus, still nursing his bruised pride, barked, "Get him!" The remaining bikers rushed forward together, hoping numbers would tip the scales, but they didn't. Max moved like water, flowing around their attacks with an ease that bordered on effortless. Each strike they threw was met with a calculated counter. Each advance ended with one of them sprawled on the floor or slumped against a booth, groaning in defeat. In less than a minute it was over. 5 men lay scattered across the diner, their confidence shattered alongside their bruised bodies. Max stood in the center, calm as ever, adjusting his cap as if nothing had happened. Lena finally found her voice, trembling as she stepped forward. Are you okay?" she asked. Max nodded, offering her a faint smile. "I'm fine, ma'am," he said simply, his tone as steady as ever. Then he glanced at the bikers who were slowly picking themselves up, their pride more battered than their bodies. "I told you," Max Carter said quietly, his words meant for them alone. "You don't want this." They didn't respond. They couldn't. The silence said everything. The diner was steeped in an eerie stillness, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed. Max Carter stood tall, his presence filling the room as the bikers began their slow, painful retreat. Gus, the leader, clutched his side as he stumbled to his feet, his face a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. Around him, his crew avoided his gaze, their earlier bravado reduced to silence. The quiet made their defeat all the louder. Max Carter didn't move to follow them, didn't press his advantage. Instead, he calmly reached down to adjust the napkin dispenser that had toppled during the scuffle. His actions were deliberate, almost mundane, as if to signal that the fight meant nothing to him. He didn't need to gloat. The lesson had already been taught. Gus's voice broke the silence, shaky but still defiant. "This ain't over," he muttered, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. His words lacked the conviction they once carried, sounding more like an empty promise than a threat. Max Carter finally turned to look at him, his expression as steady as it had been from the beginning. "It is," he said simply, the finality in his tone cutting through the air like a blade. Gus hesitated, his jaw clenching as if searching for a comeback, but the weight of Max Carter's calm gaze kept him silent. One of the other bikers, the wiry man who had taken the worst of it, tugged at Gus's arm. "Let's go," he mumbled, his eyes darting to Max Carter and back again. "We're done here." The bell above the door jingled faintly as the group shuffled out, their leather boots scuffing against the floor. Gus cast one last glance over his shoulder, his glare more a mask for his bruised pride than any real challenge. Max Carter didn't react, didn't acknowledge him further. He simply picked up his coffee cup and returned to his seat. The remaining patrons exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath the entire time. A murmur rippled through the room, faint whispers of disbelief and awe. Lena, still clutching the phone she hadn't used, approached Max Carter cautiously, her face a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked again, her voice trembling. Max Carter nodded, offering her a faint but reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Mum," he said, his tone as steady as it had been all along. He reached for his plate, now slightly askew from the commotion, and straightened it with care. Lena hesitated, then blurted, "Who are you? I mean, really?" Max Carter paused, glancing at her with the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Just a guy passing through," he replied, his voice soft but firm. As he took a bite of his now cold burger, the murmurs in the diner grew louder, spreading like wildfire. People leaned across booths, recounting what they had just witnessed as if they themselves needed to believe it. Max Carter let them talk. He had no interest in correcting or contributing. His actions had spoken for him, louder than any words could. He finished his meal in silence, a man unshaken and prepared to move on. As Max Carter placed his napkin neatly on his now empty plate, the energy in the diner shifted again. The immediate tension had evaporated, replaced by a quiet curiosity. The patrons who had watched everything unfold now exchanged glances, their whispered speculations growing bolder. Who was this man who had handled the bikers with such precision and calm? Lena hesitated at the edge of his booth, clearly torn between leaving him in peace and asking the question that everyone in the room seemed to be holding. Max Carter met her gaze, his calm demeanor offering her silent reassurance. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, his voice breaking the hush and drawing a few startled looks. She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing as she stepped away, unsure of how to respond. But Max Carter wasn't waiting for gratitude or conversation. He slid a few bills onto the table to cover his meal and stood, adjusting his cap with the same deliberate ease that had carried him through the entire encounter. The room stilled again as he moved toward the door, every eye following his steps. He could feel the weight of their gazes, but didn't acknowledge them. He had no need for attention, no interest in their admiration. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the sound leaving an almost haunting echo in his absence. Inside, the silence lingered for a moment longer before breaking into scattered conversations. The legend of what they had just witnessed was already forming, the quiet man who had walked into their lives and left behind a lesson no one would forget. For Max Carter, though, it was just another stop on the road. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the gravel lot as Max Carter climbed into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, its steady growl a counterpoint to the fading tension in the diner. For a moment he sat there, gazing out at the empty stretch of road ahead, the faces inside, the whispers, the unasked questions. He left them all behind, as he always did. Max Carter wasn't one for lingering. As the truck rolled away, the quiet of the parking lot seemed to settle deeper. Back inside, the conversation softened, taking on a reflective tone. Lena, still holding her notepad, stared at the booth he'd vacated, her thoughts a mix of awe and relief. Others spoke in hushed voices about what they'd seen, already shaping the tale they'd tell, a story of unexpected strength, calm defiance, and a lesson that lingered long after the man had gone. Max Carter drove on, his thoughts drifting not to the fight, but to the silence that followed. He didn't need gratitude or recognition. He sought neither. What mattered was the principle, the quiet stand he'd made for respect and understanding. Actions he knew spoke louder than words, and today his actions had carried the weight of his beliefs. He lay down his grip on the handlebar of the gun. It reached 200 pounds, his own bulk sturdy. The road stretched out endlessly before him, the horizon bathed in golden light. As the miles blurred, Max Carter reflected on the lessons ingrained in him through years of service. Strength was not in loudness or violence, but in control, in choosing calm when chaos beckoned. And so the legend of the quiet man spread, not because he wanted it to, but because some stories demand to be told. A reminder to judge not by appearance, to respect without question, and to understand that true power lies in quiet strength.